Hi, all. I'm Professor Tina Good, and this is for the Shakespeare class in fall 2022. I have asked you to read Hamlet this week, and so I wanted to have a bit of a conversation with you. Sorry, I didn't ask you to read Hamlet. I wanted you to watch Hamlet this week. I'm assuming that many of you have already read Hamlet. We're not going to read it in this class, but I think it's really important that we have at least a cursory knowledge of Hamlet because it is a foundational text in understanding Shakespeare's plays. And so I've asked you to read that. We had a short conversation about the play in today's Zoom call, and I hope that we can continue to talk about it in the future Zoom calls as we explore the other plays. But for all of you, even for those who could not come to the Zoom call, there are some things I want you to think about when watching whichever Hamlet version you decide to watch this week. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so we can have a little conversation about the play and things to look for when you're watching it. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to notice is that Hamlet is a tragedy. Okay, it is a genre known as a tragedy in the Renaissance. And even today, this pretty much means the same thing, that in a tragedy, the main character must and will die on stage. So Hamlet must and will die. There would have been no mystery about this. Even people going to the play in Renaissance times, just looking at the title of it, they would have known that Hamlet was going to die. So that plot point is, inevitable and not that important. What is important to consider in Hamlet is what brings about his death, right? What are the consequences of that, of the choices that he's made that lead to his death? How much of it was in his control and how much of it wasn't? Okay, traditional Shakespeare scholars will say that the tragic hero has a tragic flaw. So if that is true, what do you think Hamlet's is? Right? Often they say, in sort of uncomplicated interpretations of Hamlet, it's his lack of ability to make a decision, which, might be, but I wonder if it's really that simple. It seems unlikely, given the complications that Hamlet is dealing with, that it's really that simple. But on his journey, right, to his death, what choices does he make? And what are the consequences of those choices for him and for the other characters in the play, for Gertrude, um, for Horatio, for Ophelia, right? For Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, right? What are the consequences of his choices? And do you think that, he deserves to die in the end? How much control does he have over his destiny? Also, in a tragedy, there's generally considered to be an epiphany and a great moment of awareness that happens just prior to the death. So, if that is so, what is that epiphany for Hamlet prior to his death? What does he come to understand in a different way? An awareness that he develops just prior to his death, and how is that significant to understanding the play? Okay, so themes within the play, include, but are not limited to, um, power and corruption, particularly at the upper power structure of the aristocracy, the monarchy, right, the royalty. Um, and then, of course, there's just the relationships, right? The father-son relationships, the mother-son relationships, the friend relationships, right? His relationship with Horatio, his relationship with Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and then, of course, his relationship with Ophelia, right? So what is tied up in those relationships? What are the complexities of those relationships? And that is where, we really begin to see Shakespeare shine, this sort of delving into the complexities of human relationships and the consequences of them. Other themes include traditional thoughts of good versus evil, justice versus revenge, honor. What is honor in this play? How is honor being portrayed? Is anybody honorable? Is it that simple, right? How is honor being constructed here, as opposed to the opposite of being, deceitful, villainous in Shakespeare's term? And then, of course, the boundaries between what is divine and what is human. We will talk about this more, but there's this big philosophy during this time called humanism, and that was the understanding that within each human, is some sort of divinity, right? And so, how is that complicated in Shakespeare's plays? We'll be talking about that much more, but think about this is a really big theme in Hamlet. The consequences of extreme emotions. Shakespeare very much explores the consequences of extreme love or hate or grief in this case, lust and greed. There are other emotions, but those are the ones that are really standing out in Hamlet's play. So explore that. How is love being represented? What is love in this play, right? And what is grief, and what are the consequences of grief, and who should grieve, and how should we deal with grief according to this play? Okay. And what are the consequences of lust? Okay. And then conflict. And Hamlet's big conflict is, he's asked by the ghost of his father, right, to kill his uncle, who has, the ghost claims, killed him to take his throne and his queen. And so Hamlet is faced with the decision of avenging his father's death, but can he trust the ghost, right? And so he goes about trying to gather information, right? Does Claudius really deserve to die? Should he kill Claudius? What are the consequences of himself to himself if he commits this act? And so we see this idea of he's struggling to try to get as much information so he makes the right decision, right? And so his conflict becomes like, when do you have enough information to take action? Who do you trust? Who do you not trust, right? When gathering that information. And of course, the most famous lines in Shakespeare, to be or not to be. That's the inherent conflict going on here for Hamlet, right? Should he continue on in this life, or should he go to a better place? But is it a better place? He doesn't know. There's no way of knowing. So how do you make that decision? The women, of course, are huge in all of Shakespeare's plays, and no less so in Hamlet. How are the women being represented, right? For Gertrude, what does it mean to be a queen? What does it mean to be a mother? What does it mean to be a wife? What are the consequences of those roles, especially for Gertrude? What does it mean for Ophelia to be an unmarried woman of a certain status, right? Why is Polonius warning her against having a relationship with Hamlet? Does Hamlet love Ophelia, do you think? Or is he simply using her? And, why are Gertrude and Ophelia both sacrificed in the play, in the game these men are playing? Is that the role of women? A couple of things that, we're going to look at that show up in Shakespeare, in Hamlet, and that is some of the constructs that he used. And one is the play within the play, very commonly used. So the play within the play, you'll recall, is, sort of Hamlet asking the players to reproduce the killing of Hamlet's father in such a way that it shows the uncle having done it, right? So what is the purpose of the play within the play? Why is it there? Why do they take time on stage to repeat, what has already been stated in the play. And think about how the actors are being represented in the play. How is the company of actors being represented in the play? What is their purpose? Okay, so, and we'll be thinking about this always as we look at plays within the play, and we'll certainly talk about that again. And these are just questions I'm throwing out there and certain things I want to call your attention to, especially if you're new to Shakespeare. And then finally, as I said, the most famous lines, right, are from the soliloquy that Hamlet makes, where he's pondering whether or not to continue on in his life, to be or not to be. That is the question, right? So why? Why are these lines so famous? Why do we continue to, like, if we know nothing about Shakespeare, we know these lines? And I want you to consider, right, that the soliloquy, as opposed to the monologue, which we'll talk about later, the soliloquy as a genre is supposed to be the honest reflections of the character's thoughts made transparent to the audience, but not directed at the audience. In other words, the character is not talking to the audience and telling the audience these lines, right? The character, it's on stage, so it's not a written text. We can't see what the character Hamlet thinks, such and such. So the soliloquy is used to make those thoughts transparent. The character says his or her thoughts aloud, right? So that the audience can hear it, but they're not speaking to the audience. So therefore it is supposed to be an honest representation of the conflict that the character is experiencing, right? So think about that when we get to these moments of soliloquy. And remember, if it appears that the character is speaking either to the audience or somebody else on stage, it cannot be a soliloquy, even if it's very long. That means it's monologue, and that means something very different, okay? So remember, soliloquy, the character is speaking alone, really to himself or herself, and speaking the thoughts aloud so the audience can have a window into those thoughts. Okay, so those are some basic questions that I want you to think about, some basic themes that I want you to consider, and some basic Shakespearean constructs that we're going to see in future plays. And then once you have those things kind of in your mind after watching Hamlet, I want you to take those ideas into the play that you're reading for next week, named The Taming of the Shrew. Okay, so The Taming of the Shrew is a comedy, which would be the opposite of tragedy in Shakespearean times. And comedy, while it has come to us to mean haha funny, right, that is not what it meant at the time. Yes, comedies do have farce in them, and we'll talk about that more in the weeks to come. But comedy actually means that it should end in a wedding. If tragedy ends in a death, then a comedy should end in a wedding, and it should be the wedding of the main character. Okay, so keep that in mind as you're reading Taming of the Shrew, right? How is it following that rule, right? That the main character gets married, therefore the shrew should get married, and she should get married at the end of the play, right? And the comedy is supposed to be a happy ending. So think about, do you think the end of The Taming of the Shrew is a happy ending? And look at the overlap, right? Think about the themes that we studied in the tragedy of Hamlet. And is there overlap in the comedy, The Taming of the Shrew? Okay, so that's things I want you to think about, not only as you watch Hamlet, but as you begin reading The Taming of the Shrew next week. I hope many of you can join us again next week for the Zoom session on Thursday. And I hope you have a great weekend and a lot of fun exploring Shakespeare. I will see you, I hope, next week.